more about lawfare than I do, so I'm going to have to be careful about what I say. To my mind, lawfare breaks down into two general categories. The use of the law to directly prosecute terrorists, to restrict the activities of suspected terrorists, but direct use of the criminal law. The other major aspect is the use of lawfare to enforce economic sanctions. And that has a significant history in the United States going back to the establishment of the Office of Foreign Asset Control in 1940, really based on trying to restrict the economic activities of Japan, secondarily Germany, but mainly directed at Japan. And the law on OFAC was changed somewhat in 1950, but it's basically the same law that we had prior to our entry into World War II. It's important to properly use the law to enforce economic sanctions. They've been directed at Cuba and many other places, but primarily now directed against Iran, and to prevent the sale of equipment that can be used in long-range missiles or short-range missiles, atomic bombs, and so on. There are several options out there in dealing with a terrorist country, but economic sanctions is probably the most desirable one overall. It's been complicated because the jurisdiction is spread out among several different agencies. On the strictly economic sanction end, you have OFAC, but then you also have its parent, the Treasury Department, exercising authority. You have the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which can impose economic sanctions. You have the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. You have foreign countries that we have to work with. And in addition to that, you have the Justice Department with criminal jurisdiction. And then there's also a little local office in New York called the District Attorney of New York County, which has jurisdiction where U.S. banks are misled as the origin of money. There have been two major cases in the last year or so, one against Lloyd's for concealing the identification of Iranian money, which was then used to buy material destined for Iran. And then later, Lloyd's was a civil settlement, deferred prosecution, and Lloyd's paid a fine of $350 million, and then more recently, the case involving Credit Suisse was doing the same thing, stripping the identification of Iranian money and then buying material that was shipped to Iran through a whole host of front companies. And then there was another case involving a Chinese company which was again using nominee companies both in sending and receiving, sending material to to Iran. And they were also prosecuted because they used the U.S. banking system and concealed the origin and the destination of the goods in question. So that's a way of restricting, trying to restrict actually the activities of a terrorist country. And people talk about, we have to increase the more sanctions, but the fact is that there's a lot out there that can be done, which is not being done as vigorously as it should be, partly because of the division of responsibility. I mean, I mentioned ABM AMRO was found stripping identification of Iranian money coming to the United States back in 2004. It was fined $80 million in 2005 by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, but there still hasn't been any settlement with other organizations that have jurisdiction. So I would say before you add new sanctions, you ought to be enforcing the sanctions that we have, and that's an important part of lawfare. So I'm glad you convened this meeting. It's a very complicated and sophisticated field of lawfare. I mean, we've seen the most recent manifestation here in New York about the dispute about whether a case should be tried criminally or civilly. And it was interesting to me that in the decision initially to try it in federal district court, that no consideration was made to the impact it would have on all the other services. The New York County District Attorney's Office last year handled 106,500 cases. Southern District of New York, a very important office which I have the honor of heading, handles 1,000 cases a year. So I think that people in Washington did not appreciate the impact of bringing a major, huge case to the Southern District would have on its neighbor. Because you've got to get police officers, you've got to get lawyers, you've got to get grand jurors, you've got a whole host of people that have to come down to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and to the New York County Courthouse. And if you had all of the security which would be necessary for a major trial, it would be extremely disruptive. So let's say that there are many ramifications to any decision that's made. And the decision whether to try that case civilly or criminally has a huge impact on the neighborhood. I think also of the immigrants that have to go to 26 Federal Plaza to get their papers approved and so forth. They're not going to want to be stopped by a police officer, a barricade, and ask who they are and where they live. It would disrupt the whole flow of activity, necessary activity by immigrants who are trying to get legal status in this country. Anyway, I'm glad that this meeting has been convened, and a lot of issues here, a lot of ramifications, and maybe we can figure out better ways of doing things than we're doing them now.